Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the United States Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Politics and Markets, Shaping Post-Election Energy Policy. We're grateful to our moderator, Paula Gant, of the Gas Technology Institute, for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the United States Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest affiliate of the International Association for Energy Economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find on our website at www.usae.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Paula Gant, Senior Vice President, Strategy and Innovation at the Gas Research Institute. Paula, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, David, for that introduction and the opportunity today. Thanks to everyone who's joined us. So, with the U.S. general election now less than 35 days away and counting, and noting the perspectives aired in the first presidential debate last night, it seems that the direction of U.S. energy policy and its impact on global energy markets appears to be very much in play and at stake in this election. And that is piled on top of the ongoing effects of global pandemic, heightened climate activism, and reinvigorated social justice activism. All of this suggests the potential for a next inflection in U.S. energy policy. So today, in this first in a series of webinars that will feature leading energy market experts and economists, we will hear from 2 brilliant intellects and strategists regarding their perspectives on the ways that economics, activists, investors, geopolitics, and market fundamentals, for all you economists out there, may influence post-election energy policy. That's Kevin Book and Varun Sivaram. Something that we can always rely on when we're hearing from Kevin and Varun is their reliance on facts and data, combined with their relentless inquiry into what facts and data have to tell us about what to expect from and how we might prepare to shape the future. All of this delivered with clarity and no shouting. And despite the gloves that were used in our promo materials, I don't expect the gloves to be needed today. So first, I'm going to introduce Kevin and Varun, and then hand it over to them for remarks. So Kevin heads the research team at Clearview Energy Partners. It's an independent research firm here in Washington, D.C., where I am as well. He's sought after and relied upon by influencers, elected officials, and private sector leaders for his insights into policy, economic, and geopolitical trends that impact energy commodities and technologies. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the National Petroleum Council. He's also a senior associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Energy Security and Climate Program. Varun is currently a senior research scholar with the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. He's also a physicist and a clean energy technology expert with some global renown, who most recently served as Chief Technology Officer for Renew Power, India's largest renewable energy producer. He's also served as a senior advisor to the Los Angeles Mayor and the New York Governor's Office. He's a widely published innovation scholar, and most recently he co-authored Energizing America, a roadmap to launch a national innovation mission, which he's going to talk about a bit today. Bill Gates has praised his work as one of the best arguments I've read for why the U.S. should invest in a clean energy revolution. So that's high praise. So thanks again to all of those who have joined today. I think you're likely going to come away from this session with some intriguing new questions to ponder as to why the stakes for this election are so high. So now it's time for me to clear out of the way and let you hear from Kevin and then Varun After their remarks and some questions from me, we're going to have a lengthy amount of time for audience Q&A. So get your questions ready. Okay, Kevin, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Paula. Thank you, David. And thank you, Varun. It's always a pleasure to be on a platform with you, however virtual the platform might be. I've got a fresh night of sleep after staying up to watch the debate. So let me start by sharing my slides, and we can go through my introductory remarks, but I really think we'll probably enjoy the conversation we have afterwards because so many things are going on. My first slide is a reminder not to listen to me from our attorneys, because it might cost you money. Don't trust me, don't believe anything I say. And if you've been watching TV recently, that's probably advice you've already taken. The framing thoughts I'm going to offer are a reality check. This is not an energy election year. I'm going to outline some of the stakes. This is about transition versus the dominance agenda of the current administration. And I'm going to give you some reasons why the challenges are political and economic in nature. Here's an easy one that fits on a bumper sticker. The red states produce the fossil fuels, and the blue states reduce them. So using that as a starting point, elections often come up in the context of major national issues that rise to the surface and dominate debate. And this year, those issues are not energy issues. Years that energy does become part of an election debate usually are years when gasoline prices, 2/3 of what households spend on energy, are high. And there's a reasonably high inverse correlation between gasoline prices and presidential approvals because for whatever reason, the good people of the United States hold the chief executive responsible, and I suppose in some cases, he or she might be. Whoops, that was the wrong direction. Apparently, my competence is questionable also. Okay, so if you look at gasoline prices, not on an absolute basis, but as a share of disposable personal income, the current election cycle is happening at a time when gasoline prices represent about half of the spending they did in the Obama-Romney debate. And one of the things about that is that it de-risks the climate agenda. It makes it easier for candidates of all kinds who want to talk about climate to not worry about what the price impact might read through to the consumers at the other end. It also has the effect of diminishing the importance of energy security and taking away one of the platform planks that Republicans have often used to go for access to off-limits resources as part of economic and energy security together. When you look at the differences between the agendas, they could not be much more different. The dominance agenda is really, in the way we distill it, is deregulating production, moving it to the coasts and shipping it overseas. The word dominance being what it is, that's how we interpret it. Transitioning at high levels, really moving from molecules to electrons with green power and clean cars. Obviously, on both sides, there's much more detail, but this is a slide, and we're moving fast. The organizing principle of Trump's agenda, economic growth, of Biden's climate change mitigation. He's made that pretty clear. The main mechanism on the Trump side, deregulation and low tax rates. Biden did not mention a price on carbon last night, if you were watching. He did mention what sounded like incentives, standards, and mandates, though. If you think about the differential timeframes the candidates are acting in, Trump really has 4 more years to lock in the last 4 years. That's kind of what it means to be the continuity candidate in an election. Whereas Biden has 18 months before the next run up to the midterm election cycle to change the next 30 years. So I think we could see very different speeds. In terms of what they use within the federal apparatus, executive judiciary, probably in the Trump scenario, especially if the Congress remains divided, where I think on the Biden side, you'll see more executive and legislative focus, probably more tax policy than explicit energy policy with a focus on incentives. Stimulus spending is going to be part of either administration, a reshoring heavy industry for the Trump side, green manufacturing and deployment of renewables and clean energy technologies on the Biden side. To recap what I just said, if you look at a low pump price, what do you get? Well, you deprioritize access. So we have President Trump taking Florida offshore drilling off limits, and also Virginia, interestingly also for wind at the same time, perhaps something we'll discuss, and the de-risking of the climate activism. If you ask, why do incentives and standards matter? I can give you 2 answers. One is ethanol and the other one is renewable power. And over the last 15 or so years, both grew to be roughly 10% of the conventional resource pools they occupy. And the way they did was mostly because of tax incentives at a federal level. And for renewable power, state portfolio standards, renewable portfolio standards at a state level, and for renewable fuels, the renewable fuel standard at a federal level. So we can talk a lot about markets, but I think the discussion is in many ways moved past markets. A lot of folks on the activist side want to just do it or just shut it down. And when you look at how fast you can move when mandates come into play, you can move pretty fast. So something to think about as we look ahead. Doing it, though, becomes political almost immediately. I said the red states produce it. If you look at the fossil onshore production, gas, oil, gas, coal, roughly 80% of it comes from the states that voted for Trump in 2016. The swing states fall in the middle. There's 13 swing states in this election. The blue states, the ones that voted for Clinton in 2016, they're really not very big fossil energy producers. There's a couple of them, New Mexico, Colorado, but that's California. But in California, the upstream oil and gas sector may produce a lot of molecules, but as a share of GDP in California, it's not a big economic line item. It's less than 30 basis points of GDP. And so it doesn't get the same kind of political power that it has, say, in Texas. On the other side, if you look at the vehicle side of the mix, the blue states are where the EVs are, and the red states are where the refining and also the ethanol and biodiesel nameplate capacity are, although there is renewable capacity for diesel converting from conventional refining in California to meet the low carbon fuel standard, which puts a premium on such things. But it's a pretty clear division. If you ask, what do I look at when I think about the states economically, the carbon intensity of their production, just generally speaking, of their GDP writ large, the red states are much more carbon intensive. If you look at where the renewable portfolio standards are, they're not just in the blue states, but also coincidentally or perhaps causally, and we can discuss this, they're the states with the renewable portfolio standards programs in place. Now, one of the other legs after electric power going green that Biden has outlined is really electrifying transportation. Now, if I look at the clean car states, I count 18 if I count DC as a state, which it is not, although I was born there, and maybe one day we'll see. The only state that is officially either a low emissions vehicle state in cooperation with California or a zero emissions vehicle state, or considering it, which I've also included here, is Pennsylvania. And as red states go, Pennsylvania is a swing state that may not stay red after this election cycle. When I start to layer in the other blue states, starting with the swing states, and then the non-swing states, there's a few of them that aren't clean car states, but the red states, well, the red states are very much not clean car states. Now, what does this chart show you? It shows you in bubble size the share of the light-duty fleet. On the y-axis, you see the light-duty vehicle miles traveled per LDV, per light-duty vehicle, on a miles per year basis. And on the x-axis, you have the truck share of the light-duty vehicle fleet. What do you see? Well, California is pretty much the least average driving, least trucky state in the union with the biggest, greenest fleet. So making all cars like California isn't necessarily an easy thing to do. And in addition to the political divide, in terms of who's in and who's out, you can see that fundamentally a lot of the states that are out, other than the states that are ideologically linked to the Democratic Party platform, are red states where they drive a lot of trucks long distances. Is this a political challenge for moving ahead with an agenda like this? I think the answer is yes. I think you have to think about how people use energy all the time when you write a national energy policy or implement it, because it's all about the end user. Oops, I left out the red swing states, pardon me. Florida and Texas being big ones, also in the mix. Sorry, Texas, sorry, Florida. Here they count in elections. Okay, so the target, though, that Biden has laid out in his transition agenda is net zero emissions by 2035 from the power sector. And that actually is not such a broad partisan cleavage. There are some states that are not on track to be able to do that easily because they have very, very small clean emissions share, including hydro and nuclear. And a lot of those states are red states. But if you look at the 25 that are above the national average, it's nice when your mean and your median work out to be so close to one another. The red states have pretty clean energy mixes, mostly not because of non-hydro renewables, but because of hydro and because of nuclear. So there's there's less cleavage maybe on this target, but when you look who's got the hardest lift, it is also still some of the reddest states. Finally, to the concluding point is that when you think about how we relate to energy and what we think about, what we talk about as energy economists or policy analysts or practitioners, we're kind of deeply in the wonky space. But really what you should be thinking about is what voters think about, because in the end, when energy becomes an issue, or when energy policies that were decided because of other issues become challenging, it's usually because of the pain in the pocket. Not so much the policy details. And if you take heating, electricity, and gasoline as a share of per capita disposable personal income, this is Clearview's bottom-up state-level estimate, and then you look at the deltas between the red states and the blue states, and there are deltas in the denominator, which is to say that the per capita DPI in the red states tends to be lower than the per capita DPI in the blue states, which means that you're going to have a larger share from the same energy in a smaller wallet. But you also have longer distance drivers. And when you consider that the red states have cheaper gasoline, usually because of lower taxes in the states on gasoline, the fact that you have something like 100 basis points on average over the last decade and 87 basis points in calendar 2019, separating the red states from the blue states, means on the consumer side, there really is something that resonates with voters when you hear Republicans talk about producing more energy at home, cheaper energy, that kind of thing. They feel on average a little bit more pain in the pocket. So this is just a starting point. We have two dramatically different energy agendas, two dramatically different partisan alignments, and actually two fairly different resource bases, but for maybe the clean emissions share. With that, I will conclude. And I would note, if I look at Varun's background, there seems to be a bookshelf there. Is that a book on the shelf?
That is a book on the shelf. Thank you for priming the pump, Kevin. And I'm excited to talk about this.
Okay, Varun. Well, we want to hear all about it, and we want some good news here.
All right. Well, look, Kevin just gave you a wonderful survey of all the ways that politics will influence the election, and that the election will then influence energy policy going forward. The stakes are clearly very high. And one thing that I wanted to do was talk about one very specific way in which the stakes are high, and in which, after the election, I hope the next administration in Congress can pass a critical energy policy that I think is the #1 most important thing that can be done by this country. And it's summarized in this book called Energizing America. So let me share my screen. Have no feedback, so I'm going to hope that you guys can see it, and if you can't, just let me know. But the book is called Energizing America, and I want to give credit to my colleagues at Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy and at ITIF, the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, as well as to our founding director, Jason Bordoff, who conceived this project a year ago. He said, look, this election's coming. People are going to have large targets for clean energy innovation, developing the next generation of technologies. But without a plan that's ready for day 1 or day 100 of the next administration in Congress, no real action is going to be taken. So we set out to write this book to develop, again, the most important policy for the next administration. The reason let me start here. The reason we chose to do this is because in previous administrations, reports like this one have offered authoritative guides. So for example, ahead of the Obama administration, the Rising Above the Gathering Storm report from the National Academies of Sciences presaged the creation of ARPA-E. And ARPA-E has been one of the great successes of the Obama administration in terms of clean energy innovation. So we wanted to lay out a roadmap right ahead of this transition, and that's where Energizing America came from. Now, clean energy innovation is probably the least politicized of all energy policies. Kevin just talked to us about partisan splits across a range of different issues. But the good news is when it comes to developing the next generation of technologies, developing new and improved technologies to reduce carbon emissions, both Republicans and Democrats seem to be right on the same page. So over the last 4 years, in a rare show of resistance to the Trump administration, Congress actually increased budgets for clean energy innovation to about $9 billion today. It's not very much of the federal budget, but it's a part of the federal budget that has outsized importance, as I'll explain later. I'm sure you hear Senators Manchin and Murkowski, who co-sponsored the American Energy Innovation Act. And it's the first step forward. If it were to pass, it has, strong bipartisan support. It's the first step forward toward real investments in energy innovation. And Vice President Biden has made energy innovation the centerpiece of his energy and climate plan, pledging $400 billion over the next 10 years. The problem, and the reason we tried to write this book, the problem is that the vision and the details are unclear. So the next Congress and administration are going to need a roadmap. And this volume fills that gap, both at a high level, what should the target be, and at a low level, what should the granular details of each line item be to fund that innovation mission? The book has two parts. The first part motivates the need for clean energy innovation. Why is this the number one most important thing? Why did it not even figure in Kevin's presentation? I appreciate that he left me the room to talk about this. Well, the reason it's so critical is that clean energy innovation will drive deep decarbonization. So according to the International Energy Agency in a report released just last week, we know we're far behind on the technologies that we need. 40 out of 46 of the technologies we need to achieve net zero emissions aren't ready. They're off track. And half of the emissions reductions that we'll need in order to swiftly achieve net zero will come from technologies that have not yet reached commercial markets. So the United States, which accounts for 15% of global emissions, cannot do very much if we only look at decarbonizing our own energy system, which is hard enough as it is with these existing technologies. If we want to have a global impact and actually influence the pace of global decarbonization, developing new technologies is by far the highest impact, highest leverage thing we can do in the US. Now, there's another reason, more selfish reason for the US to invest in clean energy innovation, and that is economic competitiveness. Look, around the world, countries are developing their strategies to capture shares of growing global markets. China's already raced out in front and dominates solar panels, wind turbines, and battery manufacturing. But there are 40 technologies out there where there is no dominant player, and these markets are going to grow rapidly. The US has natural advantages in many of these markets. In digital energy technologies, we're a leader. We have the world's most valuable car company. We have the world's largest number of pilot and demonstration facilities for carbon capture. And carbon capture is going to be critical. It's virtually impossible to decarbonize the world's energy system without continuing to use fossil fuels and capturing the carbon from those fossil fuels. We also estimate, based on existing economics literature on the cost of job creation from federal investments in innovation, that targeting $25 billion a year by 2025, a tripling of clean energy innovation, could sustain 1 million or more jobs in the United States. We're falling behind. The figure on the right shows you that the US is well behind its competitor, China. It's time for the US to get back in the game. $25 billion, the target that we've chosen, is not an unrealistic or outlandish target. Frankly, in the context of previous innovation missions that have developed life-saving drugs, put a man on the moon, spawned Silicon Valley, the energy innovation mission is far lower in proportional terms. It would amount to roughly 0.1% of GDP to spend $25 billion in 2025. It's less by about half than what we currently spend on health innovation, the hugely successful health innovation mission. But that level of funding, we determined in our research, is both ambitious and achievable. It doesn't ramp up funding faster than either the federal government can invest it intelligently or the economy can absorb it effectively. So we set out to create a roadmap in part 2 of the book. And so part 2 lays out all the tools that policymakers will need in order to actually implement a national energy innovation mission and triple clean energy innovation investment. I'll just rip through these slides because I know we want to save a lot of time for discussion, but here's the broad framing. There are 3 dimensions of our roadmap. On the left-hand side, there are 10 technology pillars that we think we should organize the National Energy Innovation Mission around. The middle dimension is 6 strategic principles that can help policymakers from a top-down view not lose the forest for the trees and make sure that $25 billion is spent most effectively to maximize taxpayer return. And the third is the 100-day plan, the 3 immediate actions that we got to take in the 100 days after inauguration so the next administration in Congress can hit the ground running. Because as Kevin said, we've got like 18 months if we're really going to make an impact on the next 30 years. So I'll talk first about the 10 technology pillars. These don't look like the normal pillars. For example, nuclear and renewable energy are actually grouped in the same category for like the first time ever. And that's because we group these pillars based on critical applications. Clean electricity generation is only one of 10 critical applications, and nuclear and renewables should contribute, both in a large part to that particular pillar. Now, some technologies that you'll have heard of, energy storage, for example, are split across our pillars. So energy storage contributes to clean transportation systems, to clean fuels, as well as to modern electricity grids, long duration storage, for example, to buffer intermittent wind and solar power. Energy efficiency pervades all of our pillars, but it's concentrated here in pillar 6, clean and efficient buildings. And then the last 4 pillars are pillars that are very underfunded today, that simply don't get policymaker attention. And in the book, we lay out ways to support these, which are just as important pillars of decarbonization as many of the other ones that are more familiar, such as electricity systems. The 6 strategic principles in the middle, those offer policymakers a top-down view to make sure that they're funding the right sorts of things. And the watchword here is diversity. You want diversity in topics. So today, we misallocate our funding. We spend half of our research and development funds on electricity, but electricity is only 25% or 27% of US emissions. We should be better allocating our funding across the 10 technology pillars. So the first principle is, as you ramp up to $25 billion, make sure that you have diversity across topics. Second, you want diversity across stages of the innovation pipeline. You don't just want to fund basic scientific research. You also want to fund demonstration projects, for example, large-scale, commercially viable demonstrations of a technology for the first time that attract further investment capital from the private sector. And if you don't, which is the case right now, we really don't invest in the later stages from the federal side, you leave valleys of death where technologies and companies go to die because there's insufficient private capital. The third element of diversity is the federal government's own agencies. Today, the DOE, the Department of Energy, funds about 80% of clean energy innovation. In our roadmap, it should be funding about 50% by 2025, and a range of other agencies from the Department of Defense, NASA, the National Science Foundation should all be pitching in because they bring complementary approaches and expertise. Fourth, we should be funding universities, private firms, as well as national laboratories, and national labs are what dominate the funding today. A wealth of economics research, and I'd love to talk to many of you about this, show that government grants intelligently allocated to private firms can enable those firms to better patent, better publish, and better raise follow-on funding and actually generate revenues. Fifth, the fifth element of diversity is investing across the US, across regions of the United States. Now, Kevin mentioned that there are these partisan splits. Red states versus blue states have different characteristics. Well, the only way you're going to have a durable national energy innovation mission is if you seed these industrial clusters, not just on the coasts, but all over the country, taking advantage of different states' comparative advantages, but also building political support for the long haul. This has to be a multi-decade innovation mission. It can't be a flash in the pan. We've had that, and it had disastrous effects in the 70s. And finally, I'll mention that it's important to be predictable. That's why we lay out this ramp, because innovation is a long-term process. And without predictability, with too much volatility, research projects and innovation don't come to fruition. Now, what about the 3 immediate actions, the 100-day plan? Well, the president's got to launch the National Energy Innovation Mission, and we've written up a presidential policy directive for him to do so. And look, I'll be honest, there's only one man on stage last night that I trust to do this, and you can guess which one it is. The president's going to have to orchestrate an intricate ramp up to $25 billion, coordinating over a dozen different agencies, and we recommend creating a White House task force to do that. Second, Congress is going to have to pass a budget. Now, I do believe that both Republicans and Democrats can come together. It was a Republican, Senator Lamar Alexander, who called for a Manhattan Project on energy innovation. And so I want to see Congress pass the budget that we've proposed, and we've proposed detailed line item recommendations for each technology pillar, increasing funding the most for the pillars that are the least funded today, like carbon dioxide removal or industrial decarbonization. And finally, I think the US has to reassert its leadership internationally. We've been gone from the international stage. We'll need to recommit to things like mission innovation, the pact for countries around the world to double their investment in clean energy technology innovation. And we'll need to recommit to our bilateral collaborations as well with trusted partners from the UK to India. So that's the book in a nutshell. You know, we've been thrilled to have a great reception from both sides of the aisle, who say this could be the most detailed, comprehensive roadmap to shape the early days of a Biden administration. There, I'll just say it. I don't anticipate another administration launching a national energy innovation mission. So with that, let me turn it back over to Paula, and thank you everyone for having me.
Fantastic. Kevin and Varun, you never disappoint in stimulating thinking. I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first question. I'll remind the audience to put your questions into Q&A. I see they're already coming in. Kevin, you opened up noting this is not an energy election. And one of the aspects of that is gasoline prices aren't what they used to be, and as far as political importance. Also, energy prices generally aren't what they used to be. We're in an era of energy abundance and a happy place to be across a full spectrum of energy options. So a question for Kevin and a question for Varun separately based on that. Kevin, given that we're in this era of energy abundance and relatively affordable energy supplies in the US, what does that suggest about who influences energy policy post-election? Are the key players changing based on where the money is in these markets? And Varun, in this era of abundance, what is needed to galvanize public support for this innovation mission that you suggest, this Manhattan Project? What's needed it's going to take a lot of support and a lot of enthusiasm. So your thoughts on that. Kevin, you first.
Sure. Thanks, Paula, for the question. The reality is that until recently, when energy security was at risk, things that industry wanted were easier to get, whatever part of the industry, oil and gas, renewables, you name it. If there was something that looked like it needed to happen to protect the delivery of affordable, reliable fuel to American homes, then the political clout that came from the men and women in the industry that could deliver it was considerable. I think you could see some real examples of how that's changed. You know, it may not be the best way to think about energy. We shouldn't probably just worry about it when we don't have enough and forget about it when we think we do. But Washington is driven sometimes by shiny objects, and a little of the shine has come off. And you know, the urgency that climate activists feel align very closely with the pro-production agenda and the conservation agenda. All three things in 2008 were basically stacked on top of each other. So if you were trying to not emit, you were consistent with trying to not use when prices were high, which also was a signal to try to produce more and bring prices down. The fragmenting of those goals, which you can see in the wide divergence in the two parties' platforms, and frankly in the debate, means that you now have questions about who's going to deliver what Washington does want. And the answer is Washington wants jobs. There's a higher labor intensity in renewables. And the reason that oil and gas became what it did in Washington during the Obama administration, which came to transform energy, was because of the huge number of jobs that were created despite a low labor intensity, not because of it. Oil and gas have learned a lesson about producing more molecules than the market needs, which means that delivering those jobs will be harder in a recovery context. The two different parties would spend differently and listen differently to different players, but they're both going to be focused on trying to put folks to work, which gives sort of an advantage to a different resource within the mix, at least politically speaking. Last thing I'll say, though, and very briefly, is that markets move. And underinvestment today means scarcity tomorrow. And it might not be so long, 2023, by our numbers, before we're looking at oil deficits that bring us back to a point where conventional energy has a voice.
Look, that's man, following Kevin is not fun. I've done it twice now. But as he says, jobs matter. Folks vote based on jobs. Let me talk about jobs first. I'm a physicist playing economist here, so don't get too mad at me. A recent study came out from Breakthrough Energy and PricewaterhouseCoopers, quantifying how expensive it is to create a job using federal investments in energy innovation. It turns out it's about $15,000 per job year of federal investments in energy innovation. Moreover, the average salary from the direct and indirect jobs stimulated by investment in innovation is about $77,000 per year, and that's greater than the national average. And finally, the stimulus, the multiplier is that for every direct job created by federal spending, you go employ a scientist in a research lab, you create 2.7 indirect jobs. So the multiplier is quite high. My broader point here is I think education is needed on two fronts. The first front is that there is no more stimulative, useful economic energy policy than investing in clean energy innovation. Do we want green jobs? Sure, but the best way to get green jobs is to get jobs in advanced industries. We build up a US carbon capture industry, or US digital energy industry, or US advanced automotive industry. That will by far be the most stimulative way to create jobs, and not just for a few high-paying folks, but across a broad swath of the country. And the second piece of education is that the most useful thing you can do on climate change is invest in innovation, that we don't have the tools we need in order to achieve an energy transition. I don't think those two facts are known very widely to voters. And if they did know them, they might be more inclined to not just support energy innovation, which is broadly popular, but support it full-throatedly with passion. That's what we need.
And it all boils down to jobs, it sounds like. I think there's something else that each of you have alluded to that I want to tease out a little bit, that the importance of jobs and the importance of individual behaviors, human preferences, and other aspects of having human beings make up all these markets and political systems, and how that is being manifest in higher levels of, as we noted earlier, climate activism, economic justice activism, social justice activism. And I want to, that's a long way around the barn to lead into a question back to energy policy around social cost of carbon. And one of the mechanical aspects that's been used inside the government to think about putting a price on carbon. And I'm wondering, does that have, is that something that we'll be discussing more, and depending on the outcome of the election, one way or the other, or given these other factors and the way human beings are manifesting their preferences, we moved somehow beyond social cost of carbon into something that's even more multifaceted here in the United States? Thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm happy to go first, unless Varun, you seem to, you've given me too much credit, I think. But on this one, I think it's relatively easy to see what has happened. The Business Roundtable most recently endorsed a price on carbon, capping a list of corporate entities and individual corporations that have said, we're for this, we want the market to work. And the more progressive voices have said, we're moved past markets. When you use a word like crisis, it involves a level of intervention that doesn't necessarily have the patience for markets to iterate to an outcome. Now, I'm not sure that I've given up on markets personally. As an economist, I would feel a little naked without them. But if you look at what that means, it means that the financialization of the effects of climate change, which has been a long-running effort of activists to try to get through to investors and stakeholders and say, look, you're paying for this already. That argument has changed a little bit into an imperative that has been grafted onto a much shorter horizon timescale, which is, if you look at a Green New Deal, it's not just about energy, it's about you and your life today, not a geologic timescale thing that over the expanse of 30 years diminishes your asset values. And so we've sort of moved past financialization, except for in one respect, which is that in the regulatory process, a social cost of carbon serves a function that a government that wants to impose regulation really needs, which is to offset the explicit cost borne by the industry that must comply with the rules. So the social cost of carbon was used by the Obama administration to offset the explicit costs, the cash costs and foregone revenue costs that industry had to pay to meet the rules, and a higher social cost of carbon made deeper regulation or stronger regulation possible. I think we could see modifications not just to the formula, but to the application of the formula. We wrote about this in our recent election report. targeting some of those environmental justice constituencies, particularly when the federal government has greater than average obligations associated with things like the relocation of indigenous peoples in climate affected areas, such as the Arctic, which is warming faster than the rest of the country, then the social cost of carbon could be elevated potentially in a new rule, a new formulation. So yes, we have moved past financialization. The folks who were leading the charge have said, now we need to step in with mandates and prohibitions. But within the regulatory process, I think we have another round of social cost of carbon coming.
And I'll quickly say, I just want to underscore exactly what Kevin's saying. The social cost of carbon is this like technocratic, arcane thing that has an outsized impact on how energy policy gets made, right? If you tweak the social cost of carbon, suddenly your optimal mileage standard for fuel efficiency changes dramatically, right? It's not as dramatic under the previous Obama era social cost of carbon, but if you start doing the things that Kevin's talking about, incorporating certain environmental justice considerations into a more fulsome calculation of the social cost of carbon, suddenly it will drive that optimal fuel economy standard in every year going forward. Even more so perhaps than some of the other costs and benefits computed within. So what we've seen recently is under the Trump administration, the social cost of carbon not only has been reduced, but the definition has changed. It's no longer the cost of what a ton of carbon dioxide does around the world taken on average. It's what does it do specifically to the United States in a way that many economists have criticized. We should expect the Biden administration to reverse what the Trump administration has done, first of all. And then as Kevin says, in a very interesting insight from Kevin, they may actually inflate, not unjustifiably, the social cost of carbon even higher. And that could drive a range of regulations from power plant standards to fuel economy regulations. It is a hidden kind of invisible hand thing that will affect rulemakings for a wide range of federal regulations, and we should pay attention to it. So great question, Paula.
I love hearing those answers. Always stretches my thinkings in ways I never thought. I'm gonna shift to the globe, our place in the world, and what does this all mean for some of that? With a focus, let's have a focus maybe on China, and given lots of rhetoric around U.S.-China relations, and again, sort of a split to this question. What does the posture that's being taken on U.S.-China relations by the candidates suggest with regard to how we might develop our further develop our renewables and clean tech businesses domestically, Kevin, and what do sanctions or other types of trade, mechanisms that impact trade suggest for that? And Varun, given President Xi's recent commitment to take China carbon neutral by 2060, and the economic competitiveness strategies that go along with that, what does that suggest for this innovation mission that you're suggesting? Are we too late out of the gate?
So the world we're in right now, bigger than the China conflicts surrounding trade and sovereignty in the South China Sea and all those other elements of the U.S.-China relationship frame, is a deglobalist framework. We're coming off of decades of linking together, and we're now breaking apart. And one of the issues of COVID that I think will stoke that is fiscal stimulus tends to produce protectionism. You have governments spending so much money, a lot of it borrowed usually, on themselves, they tend to fight against competition with the recipients of that money. And we saw that after the Great Recession, where we had a modest amount of $2 trillion of fiscal stimulus in a single year. Now we have double-digit trillion. So I think as far as the clean energy innovation agenda, there are already concerns inside the US that we've been losing a fight, that China is playing an underhanded game, flooding markets, behaving in ways that are anti-competitive, and the US needs to step in and protect this sector. I think after spending this much more money, which in In either scenario, we're going to spend money on ourselves. In a Biden scenario, we're going to probably spend it on green energy. I think that may very well bring a measure of clean tech protectionism. We saw some before. During the Obama years, there were fights over solar panels precisely because of this, and because we had a tax credit for advanced manufacturing that was being undercut by Chinese anti-competitive behavior. I would note also that on the Trump administration's watch, the Bureau of Energy Resources has started looking at the value chains that are involved in clean energy technologies and looking at the ESG aspects of it. This is, I think, in its own right, probably worth doing. The Energy Resource Governance Initiative out of state seems like a worthy cause in any respect, but it also marks a question about how we're going to green the world. What will the rest of the value chain besides the thing that replaces the burner tip look like? And I think those questions create potential fragmentation of markets as well.
And I'll say a couple things. The first is that the Chinese target carbon neutral by 2060, if taken at face value, I can't overstate, it will be the most Herculean feat accomplished in human history. What you need to do, for example, just for one energy source, I'll pick my favorite, solar, you will have to build on average over the next 41 years more solar in China every single year than the whole world built in 2019 last year. And that kind of ridiculous growth rate is going to be true across multiple sources: solar, nuclear, wind, hydropower, the grid, et cetera. What China is claiming that it plans to do is one of the most impressive thing in human history. But it's not clear that its 2060 target is going to match up very well with its immediate actions. There is no immediate indication that China doesn't plan to build the 250 gigawatts of coal power plants that are currently in various stages of permitting or construction, or that it plans to stop exporting 100 gigawatts further of coal power plants around the world. And if its 2060 target doesn't constrain its behavior, it's a sign that China's target is not serious. So that's just one thing to keep in mind as we observe China's behavior going forward. I completely agree with what Kevin said, that as the race for various clean tech industries heats up, and yes, we have lost in solar, for example, batteries looks to be an uphill battle. There are 40 other industries. There's a lot of white space here, and multi-trillion-dollar markets that the US should be competing for. Should it use the protectionist tools that Kevin alluded to? I think not. I think certainly it's critical to stand up to, for example, Chinese dumping of solar panels, which were anti-competitive and damaging. But I think tariffs should not be the first tool out of our tool belt. Rather, a robust portfolio of domestic policies that are paired with the National Energy Innovation Mission I mentioned. So domestic policies to set a price on carbon, or to do public procurement of advanced vehicles, et cetera, to create markets at home, are going to support our industries, not only in a way that cultivates these industrial clusters and supports advanced manufacturing, but also speeds action on climate, because protectionism will slow the energy transition, and we can't afford to do that whether we're here or in China. The last thing I'll say is that there's a lot of attention given to the domestic aspects of US energy and climate policy. But again, the US is 15% of the world's emissions. It practically doesn't matter, even if we decarbonize the US by 2050, right? The only thing that actually matters is how we lead the world or enable the world to decarbonize. That remaining 85% will grow over time as emerging economies dominate energy demand growth. And so innovation is one critical lever by which we develop technologies, efficient air conditioners that can be deployed in India, for example. Another is global leadership in our diplomacy. Rejoining Paris is just step one. I think we should do much more, for example, through institutions like Mission Innovation that we talked about. And then finally, it'll take our diplomatic pressure on countries like China that are exporting carbon-intensive infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, and rebuilding our alliances, because the US cannot do this alone anymore. We don't live in as unipolar of a world as we have historically. So the international dimension is not just as important as the domestic dimension, it's more important. But a prerequisite of strong US international action is going to be having a coherent and robust plan at home, which not only underpins our credibility, but also underpins our competitiveness globally in these industries.
So Varun, there's been a number of things that you suggested about an urgency of getting to scale on clean energy transitions and the importance of the innovation mission, and that to what you just said, what we do here in the U.S. is sort of pennies in the pond in a certain way on climate change. So what are your thoughts on within this innovation mission, how we ensure that we're making these investments for U.S. competitiveness, we are also in parallel identifying ways to deploy those technologies at scale so they get taken up globally? That's a big lift. What are some of the big mechanisms that are going to provide for that?
And the two sets of policies have to go hand in hand. Innovation policy is not some shop over here and then you have some other shop doing deployment. The first critical cognitive leap to make is that innovation is just as important as deployment quantitatively. They account for about equal emission reduction potential. But second, in order to tightly couple innovation and deployment, you've got to be smart about it. You've got to think about investing in every stage of the pipeline, from invention all the way through research, development, demonstration, and deployment. And there's a range of tools we have to do that, right? At the far end of the pipeline, we call this demand pull policies that pull technologies out of the pipeline. You have things like carbon pricing. You also have tax incentives that can be relatively targeted, although the best research on tax incentives suggests that instead of supporting individual technologies, you should support applications, critical decarbonization needs. Now, in addition, you have a range of other potential tools on the policy front. You can have public procurement, advanced market commitments. You can learn from other agencies like NASA, which successfully got SpaceX to launch the first manned mission into space through the Commercial Crew Program. They provided milestone payments for each stage of that shuttle's development. So there's a range of tools that we have available to us. We just have to be intelligent about coupling them together. And for each of the 10 technology pillars I outlined for you, whether it's modern electricity systems or advanced transportation systems or carbon dioxide removal, you've got to have a clear roadmap about which technologies are moving through the pipeline and how your policies are going to pull them out by priming the market, by suggesting to investors, hey, the federal government's going to partner with you to help scale up the initial deployments of this technology and embolden you to then scale it up much more. I'll close by just quickly saying, the last time we did a economic stimulus, the Recovery Act of 2009, we launched a decade-long solar boom in this country because the federal government gave loan guarantees for the first 5 solar projects of 100 megawatts or greater in the world, actually. And as a result of that, investors were emboldened to invest in solar at a rate that no one ever expected. And so solar has gotten cheaper and has been deployed more widely and is the fastest growing power source in the world. We can do that for a range of technologies.
Thanks, Varun. Kevin, back to you. And dig a little bit deeper in this issue of trade policy, because we've got several questions that address this matter of in clean tech transitions broadly, with clean energy a subset of that. Rare earths show up a lot as being kind of important in the supply chain. And China turns out to be kind of an important source of that. There are other alternatives to China, but there's it's significant. So what should we be thinking about the durability of these clean energy transitions if, regardless of the election outcome, we see this sort of hawkish stance on China by both administrations? What does that mean for this innovation mission that Varun is suggesting that we be about, and our relations with other countries that might be suppliers of that, and are they effective suppliers? Well,
so we're all believers in markets here, right? This is the tree of trust for the economists with market faith. There are some market realities that I think come up, no matter how well-intentioned non-market interventions may be. And one of them is that supply is sometimes limited due to inelasticities that can be overcome when the right price signal arrives. You have a highly concentrated producer, but also processor of a limited material supply right now. But the Earth's crust is vast. I can remember testifying in front of Congress in 2007, 2008, I think it was. I was getting yelled at because my oil price forecast was like $10 below what the prevailing price was. My answer was, just wait. This will balance itself. And there's a lot of things that innovation can bring to the renewables mix where the rare earths constraint is a limiting factor, where metals constraints are a limiting factor, a scarcity premium will solve things. There's a lot of other places to get resources, but it's bigger than that, right? One of the effective policy levers that comes out of a high price is that it justifies a look again at things that didn't work before because the price wasn't high enough. And then usually there's a learning curve effect that takes you down to a more economic balance later. So Varun mentioned, among other things, carbon capture. We're talking about fossil fuels disappearing from the globe. This idea of decarbonizing completely, and as if they're this incredibly stable at atmospheric pressure and density, vast and interchangeable resource could just be discarded that provides more than 80% of global energy right now. That's crazy talk. The question is, what are we going to do about it, given the climate mandate gaining relevance in economic decisions? And the answer is that part of the looking again at what we do with incumbent infrastructure and the existing carbon fuels mix could be driven by limitations that we impose or that the market imposes on the availability of critical minerals. So point number one, critical minerals will solve themselves. Point number two, before they solve themselves, prices will produce a wider look at what we're going to be doing in an energy transition. And we're probably going to look again at some of the things we stopped looking at before. And point number three, which I think was embedded in your question, Paula, is, are we in a delicate place as we plan this transition economically, given China's relevance to the value chain? And the answer is yes, but so is China, right? We haven't deglobalized completely yet. In fact, we're using the vestiges of globalization to punish one another. Were we not so interconnected, tariffs would not be such a powerful tool. And so actually, China's ladder is still the institutions of the WTO and the global system. And good commercial practices are still the way they expand. For their own economic growth, they might not be as eager to cut off a critical resource as some of the scenarios, some of the dire scenarios might suggest, because reliably supplying the world is part of their broader economic agenda.
Well, the economist in me appreciates ending on this note of the importance that market forces are likely to continue to play regardless of where we find ourselves moving next. I'm absolutely thrilled to have been able to spend the last 50 odd minutes hearing the thoughts from both of you. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for the way that you deliver your insights, and not just with so much entertainment value, but with such deep perspective and such a commitment to what we're all about here in moving forward with human progress together. I am privileged to be able to be in this conversation with you. Thanks to all of our guests who have joined today. Thanks for your interest in that very same objective, is us all giving our best moving forward with human progress together. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to David at USAE to wrap us up. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Stay safe.
Oh boy, thank you so much, Paula. And thank you really to Kevin and to Varun as well for just an outstanding webinar. I personally learned quite a bit from this. And, this is the kind of conversation that we could just continue and continue and continue. So I'm looking forward to more of it. Obviously, landscapes move, change. The only thing constant is change, is what I'm reminded of my mother always told me. So for everyone listening, this has been recorded. It will be available on USAE's Rewind. Please encourage your friends and colleagues to listen. If you're not a member of the organization, we welcome you to join. Please visit us at www.usae.org. Wish you all good rest of the day or evening, wherever this finds you on our fine globe. And with this, I officially close this webinar. Thank you.